Biomechanics of breathing essentially just means how a person breathes, how inspiration and expiration occurs. Inspiration and expiration is obviously very important because it determines how air gets into the lungs. So before we actually go on to how inspiration and expiration works, I think it's very important to just understand some of the basic underlying structures which will help us further along when we start to look at inspiration and expiration. So the first thing that we need to know is that the lungs are enclosed in an airtight compartment, and this airtight compartment is known as the thorax. So this is essentially the thorax here, what I'm drawing out the outline of. So this compartment is completely airtight. The next thing we need to know is that there's a membrane, and that's known as the pleural membrane, and that covers the lungs. So here's the membrane, and it covers the outside of the lungs, and there are two layers of this membrane, and in between those two layers you have a fluid which kind of prevents friction from occurring in between.
Okay.
The next structure, which is really important when it comes to breathing, inspiration and expiration, is known as the diaphragm. So here we can see the diaphragm. It's a dome-shaped structure right at the bottom of the thorax. The next structures that we need to know about are the ribs. So here we see the ribs, and they surround the lungs. And a really important structure, which again links in directly with the biomechanics of breathing, are intercostal muscles. And we'll get onto why intercostal muscles and the diaphragm is really important when it comes to ventilation. Next, how does air get into the lungs? So here we have something called the trachea. The trachea brings the air into the lungs, and then the trachea kind of goes into two bronchi, which then splits into bronchioles, and that gets the air to where it needs to go in the lungs. Okay, so moving on. So ventilation. So ventilation of the lungs. What exactly is it, and why is it important? So mammals kind of ventilate their lungs through something known as a negative pressure breathing. Okay, and this means that for air to enter the lungs, the pressure inside the lungs has to be lower than the atmospheric pressure outside. This is why you require the process of ventilation, which comprises of inspiration and expiration, as I mentioned earlier. So let's make note of the two important things we need to know. The two important structures for ventilation are the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm. Okay, now that we kind of understand the basics behind the structures and the basics behind ventilation, let's move on to inspiration and how exactly inspiration works. So here I have a diagram of inspiration, also known as inhalation. Okay, so inhalation itself, that's an active process. So this process is active. Active means that it requires energy, and the energy here that is required is contraction of muscles. So inspiration essentially happens in a 5-step process, and all you need to do is really remember these 5 steps. Okay, so the first step is the intercostal muscles, which I mentioned earlier. So these intercostal muscles, they contract. That is the first step. The intercostal muscles contract. The intercostal muscles contracting causes the ribs to be pulled up and out. That's another important point. So ribs go up and out. At the same time that this is happening, the diaphragm, so the dome-shaped structure at the bottom here that I talked about earlier, the diaphragm contracts. So when the diaphragm contracts, it flattens. Okay, so both of these actions, so the diaphragm contracting and the external intercostal muscles contracting, essentially what this does is it increases the volume of the thorax. Okay, so increases volume of the thorax, and whenever the volume of the thorax increases, the pressure inside the lungs would decrease, which would cause a decrease in pressure inside lungs. Okay, so essentially, just to kind of wrap that up, the atmospheric pressure outside is now greater than the pressure in the lungs. atmospheric pressure is higher than the lungs, so therefore the air rushes into the lungs. And that essentially is the 5-step process to how inspiration works. Quick summary: intercostal muscles contract, diaphragm contracts. This causes more volume in the thorax. This decreases the pressure in the lungs, and now because the pressure in the lungs is lower than the atmospheric pressure, the air will just rush in, and this is an active process. So now moving on to exhalation. Exhalation is essentially the exact opposite of inspiration. The main difference is that expiration, breathing out, is usually a passive process, as it doesn't require the contraction of any muscles. So, looking at the intercostal muscles we mentioned earlier, instead of contracting like they do in inspiration, in this case they relax. So the external intercostal muscles relax. So, because they've relaxed, this causes the ribs to move down and out. Down and out. Okay, at the same time that this is happening, the diaphragm muscle, it relaxes. So here we have the diaphragm. So the diaphragm relaxes and it moves up. Moves up. As you can see here, the diaphragm is moving up. So both of these things happening together, both of the external intercostal muscles relaxing and the diaphragm muscle relaxing, what this does is it decreases the thorax volume. And whenever the thorax volume decreases, the pressure inside the lungs will increase. Increase pressure lungs. Okay. So now, just to wrap it all up again, so the pressure in lungs is higher than the atmospheric pressure, therefore it forces the air out, and that's expiration. So just to quickly summarize, intercostal muscles relax, the ribs move down and out, the diaphragm muscle relaxes and it domes and it moves up. Both of these actions, it decreases the volume of the thorax and it increases the pressure of the lungs. Because the pressure inside the lungs is now higher than atmospheric pressure, it forces the air out. So that is essentially the entire process of ventilation and how it occurs. So we started with just looking at the anatomy, what are the different structures and why are they important. Then we looked at inspiration and how that works, followed by exhalation, how that works. So now you should know how ventilation occurs and the steps that occur in it. Essentially what I find is that they're both opposites of each other, so they're not too hard to remember, as long as you remember the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm and how these cause changes in thorax volume and therefore pressure in the lungs. So now that we have talked about inspiration and expiration, and we kind of understand how it works, I think it's always really important to consolidate your knowledge after that. So what we will now do is we will look at an example question. So now that I've explained all this to you, I want you to have a go at tackling this question, and then we'll go through it together and we'll see what marks you got, what marks you missed out, and we'll just improve from there. And then we'll move on to the next topic. Thank you.